For 20 years, he was a ghost. A name whispered in the dark corners of the internet, a face seen only in old family photographs. He was the silent figure at the very heart of America's most haunting unsolved murder. He was the only other person, besides his parents, known to be in the Ramsey house on the night his little sister, JonBenet, was brutally killed. And for all that time, he never spoke a word. While the world spun theories, pointed fingers, and dissected every frame of his family's life, he remained an enigma. He was just 9 years old when his world fell apart. He went to bed with his sister and woke up in the middle of a national nightmare. For the next 2 decades, he chose to live in the shadows, a decision that only fueled the endless speculation. What did he know? What could he have seen? Why the deafening silence? The world desperately wanted answers, and the one person who might hold a new key was the one who refused to talk. When Burke Ramsey finally sat down in front of a camera, the world held its breath. What he had to say, and maybe more importantly, how he said it, sent shockwaves through a case that had long gone cold. This is the story of the brother, the silence, and the bombshell interview that offered a glimpse into the chaotic heart of the JonBenet Ramsey case, from a perspective nobody had ever heard before. And it left everyone asking the same question: were they listening to a traumatized survivor, or the carefully chosen words of someone with something to hide? Imagine sitting across from a man as he discusses the violent death of his 6-year-old sister. A death that happened in his own home, while he was just down the hall. Now, imagine him doing it with a smile. Not a pained grimace or a flicker of sadness, but a calm, persistent, and deeply unsettling smile. This was the image that confronted millions when Burke Ramsey broke his 20-year silence. It was a reaction so unnerving, so contrary to every expectation of grief, that it instantly became the central puzzle of his testimony. This smile would force experts and amateur detectives alike to question everything they thought they knew about the boy in the shadows. Was this the face of unbearable anxiety, or something far more sinister? The story of December 26, 1996, begins not with a scream, but with an eerie silence. In the wealthy community of Boulder, Colorado, the Ramsey home was a picture of Christmas cheer, with decorations still up and presents scattered about. But that peace was about to be shattered. At 5:52 a.m., a frantic call came into 911. On the line was Patsy Ramsey, a former Miss West Virginia and the mother of 6-year-old JonBenet. Her words tumbled out in a wave of panic. "We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please. There's a note left, and our daughter's gone. She's 6 years old, please." The 911 operator struggled to make sense of the chaos. Patsy's voice was high-pitched, and to this day, people debate whether she sounded genuinely terrified or strangely theatrical. In the background, other voices could be heard, including her husband, John Ramsey, and controversially, what some experts claim is a third voice, their 9-year-old son, Burke. That detail, from the very first moments of the crisis, would become a critical point of argument for years. When police arrived, they walked into a scene that was anything but secure. John and Patsy had already called friends over, who walked through the house, comforting the Ramseys and inadvertently trampling over potential evidence. The police response in those first hours has been heavily criticized for decades. Instead of sealing off the entire home, they treated it as a kidnapping, focusing their search on JonBenet's bedroom. They failed to secure what would later become the most important room in the house, the basement. The centerpiece of the entire mystery was the ransom note Patsy said she found on a spiral staircase. This was no ordinary ransom demand. It was bizarrely long, stretching over 2.5 pages of a notepad from inside the house, written with a pen that also belonged to the Ramseys. The author demanded $118,000, a number that was almost the exact amount of a recent bonus John Ramsey had received. The note was rambling, filled with odd phrases and movie quotes, and signed off with the cryptic initials SBTC. The meaning of those initials has never been deciphered. The note warned the Ramseys not to call the police, threatening that their daughter would be beheaded. But Patsy had already called 911. 4 hours, the house was treated as the site of a kidnapping, not a murder. The FBI was briefed, and everyone waited for the kidnapper's call. But the phone never rang. As the morning dragged on, a detective named Linda Ard asked John Ramsey and his friend, Fleet White, to do a top-to-bottom search of the house to see if anything was out of place. It was a decision that led to the case's most horrifying discovery. John Ramsey went straight to the basement. There, in a small, windowless room known as the wine cellar, he found her. His little girl was lying on a white blanket. Duct tape covered her mouth. A nylon cord was tied around her wrists and another was wrapped around her neck, attached to a broken paintbrush handle to form a makeshift garrote. John, in a state of horror, ripped the duct tape from her mouth and carried her body upstairs, laying her on the living room floor. In that moment, everything changed. This wasn't a kidnapping. It was a murder. And the killer hadn't taken JonBenet from the house, they had killed her right there, in the basement. The crime scene was now catastrophically compromised. JonBenet's body had been moved, contaminating the area where she was found. The nightmare had just begun, and the investigation was already tangled in confusion and critical errors. With the discovery of JonBenet's body, the atmosphere inside the Ramsey house shifted from panicked hope to suffocating suspicion. The investigation, which had started on the wrong foot, now stumbled into a mess of baffling evidence and questionable police work. The cloud of suspicion that would come to define the case began to form, and it settled right over the family. The autopsy revealed the horrific details of JonBenet's death. The cause was asphyxia by strangulation, but she had also been struck on the head with immense force, causing an 8-inch skull fracture. The blow would have left her unconscious, if not killed her outright. There were also signs of a sexual assault, though the specifics remain debated among experts. One of the strangest findings was pineapple in her digestive tract, which meant she'd eaten some shortly before she died. This became a key detail, because her parents at first said they didn't remember giving her any pineapple that night. The crime scene itself was a puzzle. It felt like both a staged, elaborate kidnapping and a frantic, disorganized act of violence. The ransom note was the perfect example. Forensic analysis proved it was written on a notepad from the house, with a pen from the house. Some handwriting experts pointed to Patsy Ramsey, noting similarities to her writing, though they could never say for sure she wrote it. Why would a real kidnapper spend over 20 minutes inside the house writing such a long note after committing a murder? Then there was the question of how an intruder got in. There were no signs of forced entry. A broken basement window became a focal point, with a suitcase placed right under it, as if to help someone climb out. But police noticed an undisturbed spider web in the corner of the window, casting serious doubt on whether anyone had actually passed through it. The scene felt staged, almost like someone wanted to create the illusion of a break. As the police dug deeper, the behavior of John and Patsy Ramsey came under a microscope. They hired lawyers right away and, for a time, refused to sit for separate police interviews. To law enforcement, this was highly suspicious behavior for grieving parents. They hired a public relations firm, leading to accusations that they were more worried about their image than finding the killer. The media latched onto JonBenet's life in child beauty pageants, and the glamorous photos and videos painted a picture of a family obsessed with appearances. Soon, the dominant theory inside the Boulder Police Department was that the Ramseys were involved. The narrative went something like this: one of the parents, maybe in a fit of rage over something as simple as bedwetting, accidentally struck and killed JonBenet. The other parent then helped stage the elaborate kidnapping to cover it up. This seemed to explain the evidence: the note written on their pad, the weapon made from things in the house, the lack of a real break-in. But this theory had a huge problem. DNA was found in JonBenet's underwear and under her fingernails. In 2003, and confirmed in later tests, this was identified as the DNA of an unknown male. It didn't match anyone in the Ramsey family or anyone in the National DNA Database. For many, this was proof of an intruder who had somehow gotten into the house that night. Despite this, the Boulder police remained focused on the family. In 1999, a grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy on charges of child abuse resulting in death. But the district attorney at the time, Alex Hunter, refused to sign the indictment, believing there wasn't enough evidence to get a conviction. The indictment stayed sealed for 14 years, but the damage was done. In the court of public opinion, the Ramsey family, John, Patsy, and even young Burke, were the prime suspects. While John and Patsy Ramsey were thrown into the harsh glare of public suspicion, their son, Burke, was fiercely protected from it. At 9 years old, he was the only other witness in the house that night, yet he became a ghost in his own family's story. For 2 decades, his silence was as deep as the mystery itself, and in that silence, ugly speculation grew. In the immediate aftermath, Burke was shielded. He was interviewed by child psychologists, but his parents fought to keep him away from the media storm. They moved out of Boulder, trying to find some kind of normal life away from the house that had become a dark tourist spot, but the suspicion eventually found its way to Burke. As years passed, sleuths began to focus on the boy who was there. Theories emerged that cast him not as a witness, but as a central figure in the tragedy. One of the most prominent theories centered on the pineapple. The idea was that JonBenet had stolen a piece of pineapple from a bowl Burke was eating. In a flash of childish anger, Burke, who some claim had hit his sister with a golf club in a prior incident, might have struck her over the head with a heavy object, like the large flashlight found on the kitchen counter. In this scenario, the head wound was accidental, but his parents, discovering what happened, made the choice to cover it up to protect their only remaining child. This theory was heavily pushed in a 2016 CBS docuseries, The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, which presented a case that Burke was the likely killer. The accusation was explosive, based entirely on circumstantial evidence and psychological profiling. The Ramsey family furiously denied it, and Burke later filed a $750 million defamation lawsuit against CBS, which was settled out of court. Despite the denials, the idea of Burke as a potential suspect took hold. His silence only fueled the fire. Why didn't he speak out to defend his parents? Why not share his memories? To some, his silence looked like guilt. To others, it was the understandable choice of a man who had survived an unimaginable trauma and just wanted to live his life in peace, and for 20 years, he did just that. He went to college, studied computer technology, and started a quiet career as a software engineer. His father, John, would say that Burke was a reserved person who avoided the spotlight after a lifetime of being burned by public curiosity, but the questions never stopped. Then, on the 20th anniversary of his sister's death, the unthinkable happened. The brother who had lived his entire adult life in the shadows decided it was time to step into the light. Burke Ramsey agreed to his first-ever media interview with Dr. Phil. He said he was doing it to honor his sister's memory and because he knew what the world thought of him. Everyone had waited 2 decades to hear his voice. What he would say, and the strange way he would say it, would shock them all. When Burke Ramsey, then 29, sat down with Dr. Phil, the world was watching. This was supposed to be the moment the silent brother would finally speak his truth. But from the very beginning, it was clear this wouldn't be a simple story of grief. Instead, it became one of the most polarizing TV appearances in recent memory, all because of Burke's strange and unsettling behavior. The thing everyone talked about was his smile. Throughout the interview, while discussing the murder of his sister, Burke would often break into a wide, lingering smile. It wasn't a happy smile, but it didn't look like a nervous tic either. It was a calm, almost detached expression that seemed completely wrong for the horrific topic. Behavioral experts were instantly divided. One camp saw it as a massive red flag, a sign of duper's delight, the thrill someone gets from fooling another person. They saw the smirk of someone hiding a terrible secret. The other interpretation was far more sympathetic. Dr. Phil himself, along with other analysts, suggested the smile was a result of extreme social anxiety, a coping mechanism from a lifetime of trauma. They argued that Burke, a known introvert, was so uncomfortable that his emotional responses were short-circuiting. This inappropriate effect, they claimed, wasn't a sign of lying, but of a private person struggling under an intense public glare. Beyond the smile, his story of that morning raised more questions than it answered. Burke told Dr. Phil he remembered his mother, Patsy, bursting into his room in a panic, saying things like, "Oh my gosh, where's my baby?" When Dr. Phil asked what he did next, Burke said, "I just laid there. Didn't really know what else to do." He explained that he wasn't the worried type and felt safer in his room. This was stunning to many people. How could a 9-year-old boy hear his mother screaming about his missing sister and just stay in bed? To critics, it sounded like a rehearsed line to explain why he wasn't downstairs, because, perhaps, he already knew what had happened. To his defenders, it was the honest memory of a child who didn't grasp how serious the situation was and retreated to the only safe place he knew. Dr. Phil pressed him on the theory that he'd killed JonBenet over pineapple. Burke flatly denied it. "Absolutely not," he said. He described a typical sibling relationship, with occasional squabbles but nothing more. He also defended his parents, saying they were never violent. His denials were direct, but for those already convinced he was involved, his odd demeanor drowned out his words. Burke even offered his own theory. He believed a pedophile from the pageant circuit was the killer, someone who might have seen JonBenet and stalked the family. This echoed the intruder theory his parents had maintained for years. He said he was finally speaking out to honor her memory and to address the suspicion that had followed him his whole life. "I know people think I did it, that my parents did it," he said. Ultimately, the interview split the public. If you already believed in the intruder theory, you saw a socially awkward young man, deeply traumatized, finally trying to clear his family's name. You saw his strange smile as a sign of anxiety, not guilt. But if you leaned toward the theory of family involvement, you saw something else entirely. You saw a deceptive person whose rehearsed answers and unnerving smiles were cracks in a 20-year-old facade. You heard his reason for staying in his room not as the words of a scared child, but as a lie. The bombshell interview didn't provide closure. It just added a thick, new layer of psychological mystery to an already impenetrable case. Burke Ramsey's interview didn't solve the case, but it did force everyone to look at the two main theories through a new, unsettling lens. His words and his behavior changed how people saw the evidence, strengthening arguments on both sides. First, the intruder theory. This has always been the Ramsey family's position, and it's the one Burke endorsed. From this viewpoint, his strange interview adds a layer of human context. His account of staying in his room could be the genuine, if odd, reaction of a child overwhelmed by chaos. After all, there's no manual for how a 9-year-old should react to that kind of trauma. Most importantly, the intruder theory is backed by the one piece of hard evidence that has never been explained away: the unknown male DNA found in JonBenet's clothing. In 2008, this DNA led the Boulder District Attorney's Office to publicly clear the Ramsey family in a letter, apologizing for the suspicion they had lived under. While some in law enforcement remained skeptical, this was a major turning point. From the family's perspective, Burke's interview is a reminder that the police wasted years focusing on them while the real killer, the source of that DNA, remained free. Ongoing efforts to solve the case have centered on this DNA. John Ramsey has pushed for modern genetic genealogy, the same tech used to catch the Golden State Killer, to identify a suspect from the DNA profile. As of early 2025, the Boulder Police Department, under new leadership, is actively working with federal and state partners and DNA experts to do just that, though no suspect has been publicly named. From this perspective, the real key to solving the murder isn't dissecting an old interview, but in the slow, careful work of forensic science. Now, let's consider the family theory. For people who believe this, Burke's interview was a goldmine of incriminating behavior. His smiling, his detached emotional state, and his odd explanation for staying in his room were all seen as powerful signs of deception. They argued that a truly innocent person, even an awkward one, would not smile while recounting the murder of their sister. This theory suggests the inconsistencies and the internal nature of the crime scene point to a cover-up. The ransom note remains one of the biggest pillars of this theory. Why would an intruder hang around to write such a strange document? The family theory argues that Patsy Ramsey wrote it in a panic after JonBenet was accidentally killed by Burke. In that light, Burke's calm denial of hurting his sister sounds less like the truth and more like a line he's been coached to deliver his whole life. His statement that he just laid there is seen not as a child's fear, but as the only excuse for why he didn't react to the screams, because he already knew what had happened. Proponents of this theory argue that the unknown DNA, while compelling, could be a red herring. It could have come from innocent transfer, maybe from the manufacturing of the clothes, or it could belong to someone who contaminated the scene. They believe the weight of circumstantial evidence pointing inward is just too great to ignore. Burke's interview gave a face to the mystery at the center of the family theory, and to many, that face was deeply unsettling. Nearly 3 decades have passed since JonBenet Ramsey was killed, and the case remains a gaping wound in the American psyche. It's a story with victims and suspects, but no clear heroes or villains. Burke Ramsey's decision to speak was a landmark moment, but it wasn't the final chapter. It was just another tangled thread. His interview gave us a look at the boy who grew up in the shadow of the world's most famous unsolved murder. We saw his trauma, or his deception, depending on what we chose to see in his smile. But he offered no new evidence, no revelation that could solve the case. He simply presented himself to the world and let us be the judge. Today, the hope for justice for JonBenet rests almost entirely on that microscopic trace of DNA. The unknown male profile is the most promising path forward. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, continues to push for investigators to use every tool available to finally give a name to the ghost who has haunted his family for a generation. The case is a chilling mix of conflicting clues. A bizarre ransom note written on a family notepad. A broken window with an undisturbed spiderweb. Unexplained pineapple in a little girl's stomach. And a single DNA sample that points to a mysterious intruder. Burke Ramsey's testimony is now a permanent part of that puzzle, a piece that is either a portrait of a survivor's awkward grief or a masterful performance of deception. The final question is the same as it was on that cold December morning in 1996, who killed JonBenet? Was it an intruder who slipped out of the house like a ghost, leaving only a trace of DNA behind? Or was the killer already inside the house, hidden behind a facade of perfection? Burke Ramsey spoke, and the world was left more shocked and more divided than ever. The search for the truth goes on. The JonBenet Ramsey case has been debated for decades, and everyone who looks at the evidence seems to come away with a different theory. What do you believe happened that night? Was Burke Ramsey's interview a sign of trauma or something else? Share your respectful thoughts in the comments below. This case is kept alive by the public's refusal to let JonBenet be forgotten. If you found this breakdown compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into history's most baffling mysteries. Thank you for watching.